She never raised her voice, yet silenced a room full of egos and reminded the world what real strength looks like.
The crash of glass silenced the room. A single tray clattered to the marble floor, silver cutlery, red wine spilling like blood across white linen. In the center of the stunned ballroom stood a man in a tailored suit, his hand still gripping the waitress's wrist. "Careful," he said, loud enough for the crowd to hear. "Wouldn't want to strain that weak grip of yours." Laughter rippled through the guests, polite but poisonous. Cameras flashed. The man grinned wider, soaking in the attention. The woman didn't smile. She met his gaze, calm, unflinching, her voice low enough to cut through the noise. "Let go of my hand." Smirk on his face faltered briefly. Then he tightened his grip, leaning closer. "What's the matter? Can't handle a little strength?" A hush fell. Every phone lifted. And in that silence her other hand shifted. Subtle, precise, deliberate. No one saw what happened next. Seconds later, the same man who mocked her was kneeling on the floor, breath hitched in shock, pinned by a hold so controlled it looked like grace itself. The bus rocked like a cradle as the city blurred past midnight glass. She sat by the window, forehead against the cool pane, her waitress uniform still smelling faintly of bleach and coffee. In her hand, her only luxury was a small paper cup of jasmine tea, steam curled upward, soft and patient like her. Every night ended this way. A closing shift bleeding into dawn, a stop at St. Mercy Rehab, where her mother sat in a wheelchair, humming old Yoruba hymns. "Still fighting the world, my lion," her mother whispered with a tired smile. "Always," Imani would answer, and she meant it. By day, she moved through the world unnoticed. By night, her muscles remembered rhythms she had been forced to leave behind. Once, Imani Rowe had been unstoppable. She had been a young girl in a crisp white gi, the fabric stiff with starch, barefoot on sun-warmed mats that smelled faintly of liniment and polished wood. Her father's dojo was a world of ritual and rhythm. Every bow, every strike, every stance was a lesson in discipline. "Focus," he'd said, voice low, steady, and resonant like thunder rolling through the mountains. "Strength isn't anger. It's control. Control over your body, your mind, your choices." From the first moment she entered the dojo, she had listened. She had absorbed every word, every movement, like water soaking into a sponge. She rose before dawn for extra training, her small fingers blistered but relentless. By 12, she could hold a perfect horse stance longer than many adults. By 14, her kicks were sharper than a steel blade, her punches precise enough to break boards without cracking the fingers behind them. By 16, she was no longer just a student. She was a champion. Her name appeared in local papers, highlighted with bold headlines, "The Lioness of Lawson County." Her trophies lined the dojo's front shelf, gleaming in the light from the paper lanterns her father hung above them. Sponsors came knocking, eager to attach their logos to her gi. Interviews followed, cameras flashing as she explained her philosophy. "Karate isn't about winning, it's about mastery of yourself." She spoke with a calm confidence, a quiet fire behind her eyes that refused to be diminished. Then came the day it all ended. The regional finals were held in a crowded gym, fans packed into folding chairs, banners fluttering from the rafters. She faced her rival, a girl her age with a polished style and a smug smile. Every punch, every block, every counterattack was executed flawlessly. She moved like a force of nature, her mind and body perfectly in sync. And then in a split second of brilliance, she struck and the crowd gasped. The win was hers, every instinct screamed it, every scoreboard blinked it, until the referee raised a hand and shook his head. "Too aggressive," he said, "overstepped the boundaries, too wild, too uncontrolled." The title went to her white-clad opponent instead. The crowd roared, but not in triumph for her opponent. They cheered for a spectacle of perceived fairness, blind to the injustice before their eyes. Her heart broke in that moment. Not just because of the loss, but because the world had been unfairly tilted against her. It wasn't just the match, it was the culmination of years of devotion, years of discipline, crumbling into dust in a heartbeat. The dojo suffered too. With her career gone, sponsorships vanished. The local newspapers quickly moved on to the next story. And her family, who had built that dojo from the ground up, started selling it piece by piece. The echo of her father's voice faded with each mat sold, each poster removed, each lesson discarded. When her father passed away 2 years later, the silence in her home was deafening. She remembered his final words, whispered on his deathbed, "Never let them take your fire, but also choose your battles wisely." She promised her mother she'd never fight again, not like that, not in a world that measured worth by flawed judgments and biased eyes. and so she withdrew from the limelight. She traded mats for counters, strikes for spreadsheets, tournaments for bills. Now she fought different battles: overdue notices, disrespectful customers, invisible wars waged behind the aisles of a store or across the blinking lights of an office. Wars that never made headlines, that never trended on social media. Battles where victory was quiet, personal, and sometimes painfully solitary. But even as she adjusted to a life without the roar of crowds, a small flame still burned. A quiet reminder of who she had been and of who she might still become. A lioness may be caged, yes, but even in silence, her spirit remained untamed. Her apartment was small, walls paper-thin. A window offered a view of an alley where she learned the art of quiet listening. The city's heartbeat, shouts, sirens, stray cat quarrels formed her rhythm. Every morning before work, she stretched on cracked linoleum, running through old car tires. Her body refused to forget the discipline her spirit had vowed never to use again. Neighborhood kids playing outside called her Coach Marnie. Her world had shrunk, but her dignity hadn't. She still moved with purpose. She still believed in balance, and tonight, someone would mistake her calm for weakness. The Marble Lion wasn't just a restaurant, it was a kingdom. Gold chandeliers, crystal glassware, marble floors so polished you could see your reflection. Her shifts began the same. "Smile wider, Imani," said Mr. Carver, the floor manager, hunted with warning. "Yes, sir." Guests straightened napkins but never met her eyes. Men joked about diversity hires. Someone snapped fingers instead of speaking. She moved like a shadow, quiet, efficient, untouchable. That was her armor. The CEO of a tech firm clicked his glass. "Miss, could you bring another bottle? This one's flat." "It's sparkling, sir," Imani replied gently. The table laughed. Imani smiled, the kind of smile that hides fire behind glass. Another waitress whispered, "Don't take it personal." "Funny how those jokes only go one direction," she replied. "Bravery is what's left when quitting isn't an option." The Marble Lion glimmered under the golden light of crystal chandeliers, the kind of restaurant where marble floors reflected ambition almost as sharply as the polished knives on the table. Tonight, it hosted a private dinner for MMA investors, men and women who counted money in millions and reputation in trophies. The air was thick with cologne, expensive wine, and the subtle scent of egos freshly polished. At the center of it all sat Evan Cade, a black belt in every sense of the word. Handsome, magnetic, and lethal in his skill, he drew attention effortlessly. Laughter escaped him like a practiced melody, each joke perfectly timed, his charm concealing an undercurrent of condescension that few dared to notice, fewer dared to challenge. He was the kind of man who could make a room lean in, then simultaneously feel small. Imani moved through the table, her tray steady, her posture fluid and unshakable, years of discipline encoded into every movement. The polished heels of her shoes whispered over the marble as she approached Evan's seat. The clink of crystal and silver punctuated the hum of conversation. As she reached him, his fingers brushed hers deliberately, a calculated touch that lingered just long enough to assert dominance without appearing inappropriate. A silent challenge, spoken without words. "Steady hands," he said, his smirk teasing but sharp. "But a weak grip, I bet, comes with the job." The table erupted in laughter, some forced, some genuine. Investors leaned back, impressed by Evan's swagger, by his ability to command attention. Some cheered, some nodded appreciatively, but a few exchanged glances that suggested unease. They could sense the subtle cruelty behind his charm. Imani froze for half a heartbeat, body memory seizing like an old photograph brought to life. She remembered the mats, the sharp scent of liniment, the sting of sweat and determination. Trophies lined in rows, echoes of referees who had looked past her, and the sting of bias that had once denied her victories. That moment, the tournament finals, the unfair ruling rose like a ghost in her chest, and yet she did not falter. "Maybe," she said softly, deliberately, her voice calm but carrying an edge of steel. "Or maybe I just learned not to crush fragile things." The words hung in the air like a charged wire. The laughter around the table stuttered and died, replaced by a ripple of discomfort. Evan's smirk twitched, a tiny fissure in the polished mask he wore. His eyes, for just a fraction of a second, betrayed something he had never shown before. Surprise, the acknowledgement of someone who could see him, really see him, and not blink. He laughed again, this time shorter, sharper, trying to reclaim control, but the tension had shifted. Imani's calm composure was not submission. It was quiet power, a reminder that strength could exist beyond physicality, beyond the spotlight. She moved on, refilling wine glasses with mechanical precision, each step deliberate. The crowd didn't notice the subtle recalibration, the slight dimming of arrogance in Evan's gaze. And she didn't need them to. By the end of the evening, Evan would still leave with charm intact, but the invisible ledger of respect had shifted. Imani didn't need the roar of the crowd or the flash of cameras to mark her victory. Sometimes, the most profound wins were invisible, etched quietly into the spaces between words, gestures, and glances, and tonight she had left a mark Evan Cade would not forget. Later, in the quiet corridor behind the marble lion, the echoes of clinking glasses and forced laughter faded into silence. The polished marble walls reflected the dimmed chandeliers, casting long, fractured shadows that seemed to mimic the tension in her chest. The staff moved quickly, collecting plates and wiping down surfaces, their murmurs punctuated by the occasional clatter of a tray. "You shouldn't talk back," a familiar voice hissed from the shadows, low but sharp. "People like him. People like you don't fight. You'll lose everything." Imani's eyes didn't flicker. The warning, meant to intimidate, only stoked the embers of a fire that had long lain dormant. She straightened her shoulders, feeling the subtle weight of every past defeat, every injustice, every referee who had looked the other way. The losses she had endured weren't just trophies left behind, they were lessons in disguise. "I already lost everything once," she said, voice steady, carrying the quiet authority of someone who had stared into the void and refused to blink. "This time, I'll keep my dignity." The corridor was silent for a moment, as if her words themselves had shifted the air. Even the faint hum of the restaurant's refrigerators seemed to pause, acknowledging a resolve that couldn't be dismissed. By midnight, the patrons had vanished, leaving the grand dining room empty except for the gleam of polished floors and the lingering scent of roasted meats and aged wine. Imani lingered at the edge of the glass walls, fingertips lightly tracing the cool surface. Her reflection stared back, stronger than she felt in that moment. The girl who had once been denied victories now looked every bit like someone who could claim them on her own terms. Outside, rain began to fall, soft, cold, and steady. It slid down the windows in rivulets, blurring the neon lights and turning the world into a watery painting. She stood there for a long moment, watching, feeling, breathing it in. To anyone else, it was just weather. To her, it was applause from the universe, a quiet affirmation that even in the darkest, coldest hours, life had a way of acknowledging resilience. The city slept beneath the rainfall, unaware of the invisible battles being fought in its corridors. But Imani didn't need an audience. She didn't need headlines or accolades. The lesson had begun, and it would be learned in the spaces where power, patience, and precision intersected. Tonight, the first chapter of that lesson was written, not in ink, not in trophies, but in unwavering presence, in calm defiance, in the subtle reclaiming of herself. And as she finally stepped into the street, letting the rain soak through her coat, a small, almost imperceptible smile tugged at her lips. The storm outside mirrored the storm within, and for the first time in years, she welcomed it. The ballroom shimmered with opulence, the kind of light that gleamed off crystal chandeliers and polished silverware, reflecting laughter that was expensive, practiced, and indifferent. The clatter of plates, the low hum of conversation, and the occasional chime of glasses created a backdrop that was almost musical, if you ignored the subtle undercurrent of judgment, power, and ego. Imani moved with a careful grace between the tables, tray balanced in her hands. Every step, every tilt of her wrist, every flicker of her eyes was controlled, precise, a dance honed from years on the mats. Her pulse remained steady, even as her mind catalogued the room, the investors leaning forward expectantly, phones poised like witnesses, and Evan Cade in the center, stretching with effortless confidence, a smirk that could cut glass. A donor, an older man with a gold ring glinting on his finger, leaned forward, voice sharp with expectation. "Why don't we see a demonstration?" Phones rose simultaneously, 100 tiny screens capturing the moment like predators circling prey. Cameras flashed. Eyes widened. The room seemed to hum with anticipation, as if the air itself knew something dangerous was about to unfold. Evan stood, shoulders relaxed, smirk widening. "Let's show them how not to hurt someone. I'll be gentle," he said, his tone mocking yet poised, the kind of charm that drew people in while keeping them off balance. Imani's body froze instantly. Years of training, of discipline, of tournaments won and lost flashed before her eyes. The mats, the referees, the victories denied, the false smiles of spectators, Everything coalesced into a single, instinctive thought. "Please," she said softly, voice calm but resolute. "Don't touch me." Her words landed in the room like a whisper against thunder. The chatter halted. Phones wavered in midair. Glasses clinked against plates, unnoticed. Even the chandeliers seemed to pause, suspended in the tension that now vibrated across every polished surface. Evan's grin faltered, just slightly, but enough for the room to notice. His fingers brushed hers as he reached forward, and she could feel the tightening of his grip, an assertion of dominance he had always relied upon. But this time she was different, centered, controlled. Her body didn't flinch, her feet rooted to the ground, her eyes locked with his, and in that instant a silent battle unfolded, one not of brute force, but of will, precision, and clarity. Every muscle in her body was alive with awareness, every breath measured, every heartbeat a drum of quiet power. For a heartbeat, the room went utterly still, the silence almost unbearable. Then she moved, not in aggression, not in fear, but in absolute control. Her hand slid gently from his, releasing the tension, and her posture remained unwavering, a quiet assertion that no one, not even Evan Cade, could manipulate her without consent. A murmur ran through the ballroom. Investors exchanged glances, some impressed, some wary. The power balance had shifted, subtle but undeniable. She had not struck, she had not raised her voice, yet she had claimed the room. Evan, recovering his composure, smiled again, but this time it was tighter, more cautious. The charm remained, but the arrogance had diminished, if only slightly. Imani continued serving, tray perfectly balanced, every movement a reminder that strength was not always visible in fists or speed. Sometimes it was in restraint, in presence, in control. And as she stepped back to the side, letting the room breathe again, she realized this was her lesson, unfolding not on a mat, not in a gym, but in a world far more treacherous, the world of influence, power, and appearances. And she was ready. The chandelier lights shimmered like liquid gold across the polished ballroom floor, reflecting the polished smiles of the investors, the glittering crystal of wine glasses, and the palpable tension in the air. Laughter had filled the room moments ago, light and careless, but now it trembled on the edge of uncertainty. Imani moved like a shadow, her tray barely swaying, each step precise, controlled. She approached Evan Cade, who was still basking in the echoes of his smirk, oblivious to the storm gathering behind her calm exterior. The murmurs of onlookers dimmed, as if the room itself recognized the impending collision of past and present. Her hand moved subtly, almost imperceptibly at first, brushing against his wrist as if by accident. But the motion was deliberate, a quiet assertion of authority honed from years on the mats. His laughter, that trademark sound that had once charmed and intimidated, stopped abruptly mid-chuckle. The room froze, sensing the sudden shift in power. Gasps rippled through the audience as recognition dawned. The man who had just been silenced was none other than the commentator from her final disqualification years ago, the one whose smug grin had punctuated her loss on live television. Every mocking word, every biased call, every patronizing comment came flooding back. "Still think I can't take a loss," she said, her voice low and sharp, carrying an undercurrent of all the years she had endured, all the moments she had been overlooked and underestimated. The crowd held its breath. Phones clicked, cameras recorded, champagne glasses trembled in half-raised hands. Evan's eyes widened, an almost imperceptible tremor betraying his composure. He opened his mouth to retort, but she finished for him. "The one you mocked on live TV," she continued, her fingers tightening on his wrist just enough to assert control, not to harm. Her movement was subtle but precise, a reminder of muscle memory, of countless hours spent learning leverage, balance, and timing. The twist was slight, yet in it was absolute authority, enough to silence arrogance and command respect. The ballroom went dead silent. Not a chair squeaked, not a whisper passed, only the sound of a held breath, suspended anticipation. Cameras focused, flashes capturing every nuance of the moment. The rigid jaw, the narrowing eyes, the barely contained panic behind the polished facade. Evan stumbled back, visibly humiliated, his charm cracked, his confidence shaken. The smirk that had once held power over others faltered, replaced by a thin line of tension. For the first time, he had been met by someone who matched him step for step, mind for mind, precision for precision. Imani's voice carried softly, almost like a caress but edged with steel. "Don't mistake grace for weakness again." Word hung in the air, heavy with history and authority. She had not shouted. She had not struck. She had not given the crowd a spectacle to cheer or fear. Yet in that measured control, She had dismantled the arrogance that had haunted her for years. The investors and onlookers exhaled collectively, some in awe, some in relief, some in disbelief. Cameras captured her poise, the quiet dominance, the assertion that true power did not always announce itself in volume or violence. It often came in stillness, precision, and control. Imani released his wrist. She stepped back, letting the silence linger just long enough for the lesson to cement itself in the minds of everyone present. In that moment, past and present converged, a reckoning not just of skill, but of patience, resilience, and quiet strength. She moved away gracefully, tray in hand, the echoes of the moment reverberating long after her footsteps faded. The ballroom might have returned to chatter eventually, but the memory of her control, her subtle dismantling of arrogance, would linger far longer. And for Imani, it was more than victory, it was closure, power reclaimed, and dignity restored. 17 seconds. 17 seconds that rippled through the digital world like a shockwave. The clip was brief, just enough to capture the moment. The hush of the ballroom, the precise commanding twist of her wrist, the disbelief frozen on Evan Cade's face, and Imani Rowe walking away, poised, unshaken, untouchable. Within hours, it had been shared on every platform that mattered. Comments flooded in, some awed, some incredulous, some celebratory. Grace under pressure. Skill over arrogance. Finally, justice in motion. The hashtag Lioness Returns trended by morning. Memes, reaction videos, and think pieces dissected every subtle detail. The silent control, the calm authority, the quiet dismantling of a man who had thrived on mocking others. Old footage resurfaced. Clips from her teenage championships, the controversial regional finals, the referees' biased calls, all revisited under new lens. People began to connect the dots. The years of excellence overlooked, the systemic prejudice she had faced, the resilience required to endure it all. Sponsors who had once ignored her came under public scrutiny, while those complicit quietly withdrew support from those who had undermined her. The National Combat Arts Federation convened an emergency review. Her past disqualifications, previously dismissed as trivial or part of the game, were reopened. Analysts examined score sheets, referee reports, and video footage. Bias, once hidden behind authority and tradition, now lay exposed under the unforgiving light of transparency. Reporters dug further. They uncovered patterns, preferential treatment for some competitors, dismissals of talented fighters of color, and a subtle but pervasive culture of exclusion. Long-buried stories were unearthed. Former athletes spoke anonymously, confirming what many had long suspected but feared to say. The narrative shifted. And then Imani Rowe's name, once whispered or ignored in local papers and gym circles, was restored. Not just restored, but celebrated. Features appeared in major publications, interviews aired on national broadcasts, and podcasts dissected her technique and composure with reverent awe. She was no longer a footnote, no longer the girl denied victory. She was a symbol of strength, precision, and dignity. The world began to see what true strength looked like. Not raw power, not loud dominance. Not fleeting fame. True strength was patience honed into skill, resilience forged through injustice, and the ability to act with quiet authority when the moment demanded it. Imani herself watched the viral reactions with measured calm. She had never sought revenge. She had never sought validation. But now, watching the acknowledgement ripple outward, she felt something rare, the satisfying alignment of justice, skill, and recognition. And somewhere deep inside, the lioness smiled, not for fame, not for applause, but for the simple, undeniable truth. She had reclaimed her story. The world had watched, learned, and finally recognized her. Weeks later, the hall was filled with anticipation, yet it felt different from the flashy arenas and corporate ballrooms she had endured. Here, there were no cameras flashing, no investors leaning forward with expectation. Just students, martial artists, and a few dignitaries who had come to witness her words, and more importantly, her presence. Imani stood at the podium, simple in attire yet radiant in poise. Every inch of her posture spoke of years of discipline, of battles fought quietly, and victories claimed without fanfare. The microphone picked up the calm authority in her voice, carrying it effortlessly across the room. "Discipline doesn't depend on who's watching," she began. "It's who you are when no one sees you. Respect isn't about who hits harder, it's about staying centered when the world tries to unbalance you." Her words were not shouted, they didn't need to be. They resonated in the silence between breaths, in the focused eyes of her audience, in the subtle nods of understanding that rippled through the room. Every student felt the weight of her message, not as a lesson in technique, but as a lesson in life. She spoke of patience, precision, and restraint, the lessons that had been forged in her teenage defeats, honed in years of quiet observation, and proven in moments when the stakes were high. She spoke of standing firm against arrogance, of claiming power not through spectacle, but through mastery of self. And though the crowd was captivated, her gaze found Evan Cade in the back of the room. He stood quietly, a rare humility in his posture, acknowledging her mastery without words. At the end of the session, he approached and gave a small, respectful bow, a gesture that spoke louder than any applause ever could. Imani's victory was not loud. It did not rely on viral clips or public vindication. It was precise, controlled, and rooted in dignity. Students from across the globe tuned in online, drawing inspiration from her technique and her philosophy. They saw someone who had faced bias, endured loss, and emerged not bitter, but refined, stronger, and unshakable. Her calm became the eye of the storm. The chaotic, impatient, and arrogant energies of the world could not sway her. She had turned silence into authority, restraint into influence, and integrity into power. By the time she stepped down from the podium, the room was still. Not because they had been silenced by fear, but because they had been moved by understanding. Real power, Imani demonstrated, was not measured in volume or aggression. It was measured in self-mastery, in patience, in unwavering principle. For the first time in years, she felt the fullness of victory, not the fleeting kind that comes with applause, but the deep, steady satisfaction of dignity restored. She had reclaimed her narrative, her name, and her life. And in doing so, she had become more than a champion on the mat. She had become a living example of what true strength looks like. And somewhere in the quiet corners of the room, the world finally saw it too. The world had a way of measuring success in decibels. The louder, the prouder, the flashier, those were the victories everyone noticed. Crowds cheered for brute strength, for spectacle, for confrontation. But Imani Rowe had discovered another kind of power, one that didn't need noise, applause, or social validation, one that didn't demand viral recognition to be real. She learned that true strength often resided in the silence, in the stillness between actions, and in the courage to remain unshaken when provoked. Across classrooms, dojos, and even online tutorials, the clip from the marble lion had become something more than viral content. It became a teaching tool, a case study in restraint and centeredness. Coaches paused the video to show students the subtleties of her movements, the slight shift in weight, the measured adjustment of her wrist, the calm control in her gaze. Analysts discussed the psychological dimensions, how anticipation, patience, and awareness could neutralize arrogance without striking a single blow. Philosophers and martial arts theorists alike debated her approach, agreeing that it transcended technique, crossing into the realm of character. It wasn't just about combat or skill, it was about presence. Imani demonstrated that anyone could fight, but very few could teach. Fewer still could truly lead by example. Her victory wasn't counted in points or trophies, but in the impact she had on the perception of strength itself. She began receiving letters, emails, and messages from around the world, young martial artists, both men and women, who had felt overlooked or underestimated, who had faced bias, who had been denied opportunities. They wrote of the courage they drew from her composure, the inspiration in seeing someone confront injustice without losing herself in anger. "You showed me how to win," one letter read, without swinging a single punch. Even in her hometown, where whispers of her teenage victories had faded into the archives of local papers, Imani's name resurfaced with reverence. Interviews revisited her early championships, highlighting the resilience it took to recover from bias, loss, and grief. Every tournament denied, every referee's glance that had overlooked her now seemed less like failures and more like a preparation for this very moment. The moment where she could redefine what winning truly meant. And yet she didn't chase the spotlight. The accolades, the viral attention, and the fame that followed were byproducts, not goals. Imani's victories were quiet. She trained students not just to punch harder, kick faster, or react quicker, but to understand themselves, to know when to act and when to wait, to master not only the body but the mind and spirit. In dojos across the country, instructors played the footage to illustrate the principle that discipline outweighs reputation. A strong fighter can intimidate, overpower, or dominate, but a centered individual inspires, teaches, and endures. She had endured derision, bias, and unfair rulings, yet she remained unbroken. Her patience, precision, and grace had taught the world an invaluable lesson. The depth of a person is revealed not in the heat of conflict, but in the steadiness of their response. Even Evan Cade, the once arrogant black belt whose smirk had masked condescension, had been forced to confront his own assumptions. In dojo seminars and private sessions, he observed students who emulated Imani's measured techniques, who held themselves with calm authority, and he understood without needing to voice it. Real strength did not require ego. Recognition came not from making others stumble, but from holding oneself upright, unshaken, regardless of provocation. The lessons spread far beyond the mats. In business seminars, corporate training, and leadership workshops, Imani's philosophy became a template: how to navigate pressure, how to assert influence without intimidation, how to maintain integrity when the stakes are high. Her story reminded people that resilience wasn't about confrontation, it was about alignment, aligning values with actions, patience with precision, and courage with principle. Parents shared her clips with children, teachers used her calm to illustrate conflict resolution, and coaches cited her movements as evidence that mastery transcends physical ability. Schools even integrated her philosophy into anti-bullying programs, emphasizing that power misused often caused harm, whereas strength grounded in awareness and respect uplifted those around it. But perhaps the most profound impact was internal. Those who had once been overlooked, who had been judged too harshly, who had been told they were too aggressive or too soft or too much, began to see themselves differently. Imani became a mirror, reflecting not only what they could achieve with discipline, but also what dignity looked like when fiercely protected. And yet she did not seek this recognition. She moved through the world with the same quiet precision she had always possessed. When accolades came, she accepted them with grace. When students idolized her, she reminded them that the greatest victories often went unseen, appreciated only by the individual who earned them. When social media celebrated her, she focused on the deeper work, teaching, mentoring, and guiding the next generation to discover that their own center was the source of their power. Imani Rowe had once been a girl denied a championship she had earned. She had once been mocked, dismissed, and underestimated. But in the years that followed, she transformed loss into mastery, bias into clarity, and silence into influence. She did not need to shout to be heard, nor strike to be respected. She understood that strength was not proven by how hard you hit, but by how deeply you stood in your truth. And so, across classrooms and dojos, in quiet studios and crowded gyms, her story became legend. Students practiced not just techniques, but the principle she embodied, that real triumph often comes from what you don't do. You don't strike out of rage. You don't respond to arrogance with anger. You don't fight for recognition. You fight to remain whole, centered, and true to yourself. Her victories were measured not in points or applause, but in the dignity she carried, the calm she displayed, and the lives she touched by simply refusing to be unbalanced. When the world expected her to break, she bowed instead. When it anticipated a spectacle, she delivered restraint. When it demanded spectacle, she showed composure. The lioness they finally realized had never lost. She had simply been waiting for the right moment, for the right audience, for the world to catch up. And when it did, she didn't need to raise her voice, swing her fists, or demand attention. She simply walked away, unshaken, centered, and victorious. Imani Rowe's quiet triumph became the ultimate lesson. That power without ego, grace without concession, and strength rooted in principle could outlast reputation, silence arrogance, and teach the world what it meant to truly win. And somewhere in that stillness, across mats and classrooms and glowing screens, the world learned that a victory's echo does not come from noise. It comes from the unshakable integrity of a person who knows their own worth and refuses to surrender it. She had not only reclaimed her name, her dignity, and her story, she had redefined what triumph itself could mean. Imani Rowe didn't win with strength alone. She won with center. She won with patience. She won by holding steady when all eyes expected her to falter. She won because she understood a truth the world often overlooked. The fiercest battles are not fought with fists, but with focus, control, and the quiet courage to remain yourself. And in that quiet triumph, she became more than a champion. She became a standard, a legend, and a teacher whose lessons would resonate long after the applause had faded.